My attitude about humans has changed since we were together. I've learned that there are good and bad humans just like animals.
This lovely lady is Katherine E.D. Swift, Katie to her friends. And we're going to just talk about the process of doing this book. It was my second one, so I'm fully experienced in the business now. But it is an interesting exercise, and at least from my perspective, and I'm sure Katie has her own perspective, and we're going to talk about that a bit, starting with how she ended up on this project. But I have to ask first, Katie, what is the ED stand for?
I have two middle names, Elizabeth and Danelle. When I was born, my maiden name was Miller, and we lived in Dover, Ohio. So, that's close to Amish country, and there were lots of Catherine Elizabeth Swifts. So I make sure to put the D in there too.
Okay. My son has two middle names as well. So I could relate, and that's what I assumed it was, but I like it. My books are under G.O. Gooding because I don't particularly like Gary. Because I didn't feel, sorry, Garrett, I didn't feel that was quite sophisticated enough, but I really like Katherine E.D. Swift. That's going to take you far. Anyway, for those tuning in and listening to this, probably, when was it? In maybe summer? I don't remember exactly when I talked to Robin Blakely, who at Creative Center of America, who does all of the heavy lifting for me, that I wanted to turn two of my books into audiobooks, Fresh Snow on Bedford Falls and Yellum, for very specific reasons that may come up in this conversation. We picked Yellum, and then we had the exercise of picking who was going to do the voices, who was going to narrate the books. The first one was easy because I had a long-standing dream that George Goodell, who's world famous as a narrator, I've listened to over 200 of his books. And I said, if we could make that happen, it would be a miracle, first of all, and second of all, it would be a dream come true. So that happened, and I was delighted. And then I think by count, Robin went through probably 100 or so, at least 100 on ACX, the narrator profile website, looking for somebody to do Yellum. And we narrowed it down to 2 or 3, and voila, Katie Swift came into our lives. And Robin contacted you, and tell me a little bit about that conversation, that first conversation, and we'll see what holes are left based on what you share that I can ask you.
Well, I remember the first conversation when she reached out to me. I was a little shocked because I had just finished a different production and I had decided I was going to take a break. I had just had my second daughter and we were about to move. And so I thought I had closed off my account, but I did not. And I'm glad I didn't because Robin was able to find it and reach out to me. And so that's kind of what tipped me off that, maybe this was part of God's plan for you to be able to find me. So,
yeah, that's what it would seem. That I was going to ask how, clearly that changed your mind. It seemed destined that we would find you. And so then she sent you the book?
yes, she sent me a link to the Kindle version, and then I was able to look through it. And she also sent me an excerpt to do for you so that you could hear what it would sound like as me as the narrator.
And you didn't, nothing you saw initially changed your mind back into retirement, right?
No.
So besides obviously the Christian content, the tenor of the work, what else appealed to you about the story?
So you knew I was eager to work on a Christian book,
Yes.
well, Christian-based book. But I was also really looking to get into work that required me to be creative, with my voice in particular, and also that would stretch my ability to come up with different sounding characters. So it kind of just all flowed together and seemed to be exactly the fit I was looking for.
Well, we were thrilled with what you did, and Robin just keeps saying, like, she's got a voice. This should be a Pixar movie. She says she nailed that. And the background of the story, which comes later in the notes, but I'll share it now because it seems timely, was I started this book when my son was a year old. And he's now will be 43 in June. So it only took somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 years to finish, and it kept being different iterations, because it started out for a book for a toddler or a young child, and then he got older, so I had to go back and revisit it and rework it, and then he got older, and then it fell into the dustbin in a drawer, and finally came back to life. And I gave him a copy of the draft when he was 19, and that was kind of like that was going to be the end of it, till I did Fresh Snow, and then I got inspired to do more writing and pulled it back out. So it took a long time to get there, and so I don't know how to categorize this book, because it has some level of action and for lack of a better term, violence, or some fighting or that stuff, which doesn't necessarily make it a children's book, but it also deals with animals. So which makes it something that might appeal to a younger audience. So how did you interpret the book when you first saw it? Did you see it in that light at all?
I didn't see the more violent sections to be overwhelmingly violent. So I guess when, especially in the first stages of the book, I could definitely visualize it as kind of like a Pixar movie. So I could see it appealing to younger kids, but at the same point, you get into topics and use words that would appeal to adults as well as some teens and some, you know, in betweenies between the teens and the adults. So I think it's a very broad spectrum. I think if parents or teens or young adults read this book and then kind of make it a little simpler for the littles to understand, I think it could be a very well-rounded story that could be used throughout all the ages, to be honest.
Oh, that's exactly what I was, as I wrote it, and I was dealing with the use of certain words, but I maybe rationalized, well, this is a good opportunity for a parent to explain what that word means in simpler terms and help them understand in a clearer context what's going on in the story. And you did a wonderful job of delivering and being consistent from beginning to end, because like when I was writing it, it could have started sounding like a child's book and then ended up being, very adult oriented. But you help make my words travel from beginning to end in an effective way. So I'm know bits and pieces of how you arrived at even offering yourself up to be a audio narrator, but you have a very wide background yourself. Could you share that with me and others?
Yeah, so I actually went to college for a double major in vocal performance and music education. And so I have a background in opera, jazz, all those types of singing, other styles as well. I used to be a singer-songwriter, and I'm trying to pick that back up as time allows. But So I have the background in singing and just understanding how the voice works. And so that allows me to play with the timbre of my voice, and the different features of how a voice works in order to create the different character voices. And then on the education side of things, that has really allowed me to be exposed to kids. I was an elementary general music teacher at Clear Fork local schools for 2 years before I became a stay-at-home mom. And so I've been exposed to kids pretty much my whole life between that and my nieces and nephews. And so that background has allowed me to read stories, make up stories, put on plays with these little kids, and just really make the stories come alive for them, because there's no greater joy than when you look at a kid's face and you're reading that story to them and you're putting the character voices in there and allowing them to really internalize the story and them excited about reading, but also the story itself. So I have a pretty big background in singing as well as some acting, and then as well with children interaction.
Where did you get this training? Where did you go to school?
I went to the University of Akron and I studied under Dr. Lori Lashbrook.
Well, yes, and you're way too young to have that much experience. Goodness gracious, it's that's great, and I love music and sing and not certainly at a level that you do, but I can really appreciate how that would enable you to extend yourself into another arena. Did you anywhere along that line say think about narrating?
The first idea of narration came to me when we were living in Mount Vernon, Ohio. I needed something to plug my creativity into because we had moved so far away from Akron that I wasn't able to sing in public capacities, but I sang at my church, obviously, which was very fulfilling. But I wanted to do something more. And so I kind of branched out into the audiobook work when I found out about it.
When my vision went started going bad, and with retinal detachments at first, I had to lay down for 18 hours at a time on one side or the other. And so I went to the library and started getting audiobooks, and that hooked me on audiobooks. And the biggest aha moment for me, because I'm not a great reader, I'm an author and writer, but I'm a terrible reader, was how it added a third dimension to the experience of a reading, because it brought the words out, and made them be alive to me. And when I hear somebody reading and doing a really good job of narration, you really get sucked into the book a lot more than you're not laboring to do the work. You're trying to look at the words and read the words and then process them into an image and whatnot. You actually can sit back and just absorb the story in a much more deeper and for meaningful books, more meaningful way, and for adventures or whatnot. You really appreciate the action and what's going on. So, that's why I fell in love with, besides not being able to see well, fell in love with audiobooks. And I intend at some point to have my other books done, that if I ever get back and finish the ones I'm working on now. Anyway, so as you went through so tell us a little bit about the process once we committed to you doing the story, and I know parts of the answer to that because you were very, very good at sharing questions and samples and whatnot, which I really appreciated, because I didn't know myself, how some of those characters should sound, because I'd never looked at the work in that way. So tell us a little about the process you did putting together this book, which was a long book.
So the process behind me reaching out to you about the characters is I just wanted to kind of figure out in your mind's eye what each character looked like, what their personality type was outside of just what was written in the book, how you really internalized each character while you were writing about them. And so I did sketch down here about how we approach the array of voices. So if you want to hear about that process, I can talk a little bit about that. That might be easier.
That would be, well, you had to use that process a lot, because I never counted how many characters you had to do, but there were a lot.
Yeah, quite a few. So
you might have said no if you'd known that in the beginning.
No, right? Not at all. That was part of what I was looking for. I wanted to have a challenge. So I wanted to make sure that each character had his or her own unique voice. Even if they sounded close, there still needed to be some determining factor that allowed the listener to distinguish between the characters. So I worked with each character, and I know that you also asked me to distinguish the human voices by giving them a Middle Eastern accent. So I actually went in and I rewatched some of the new series that's on TV called The Chosen. That's about the life of Jesus, and I
soaked in disciples,
yeah, and I soaked in their accent that they all worked on, because Jonathan Rumi actually came up with that accent from an array of accents that he has within his family, and then shared it with the whole cast so it could sound the same. So I worked on that accent and then applied it to the human voices and left the animal voices with no accent as requested by you. And then for each voice,
did you think that was the right thing to do?
I do. I think that really helped, and that helped me as well to be able to make some of those voices sound similar to one of the animal voices, but still be able to be different. So that was a big help. But for each voice, I played with placement and timing and also impediments. So it was always a bit more difficult when dealing with a large cast of human voices, as you might guess, because animals tend to allow for a bit more of cartoonish freedom.
Right.
But humans, especially several male voices, as this book had, was a bit of a challenge being a female voice, because my voice can only go so low. And so the pitch of most of the men hangs around the same level. I try to dip as low as I can on some of them, but I knew if I could just delve into a couple of the characters and tell you about how I came up with their voices, if that's something you're interested in hearing about.
Yes, I'd love to hear that. I just, it struck me when you were saying that, though, that when Robin and I were deciding on the voice for narrating Yellum, we both decided that a female voice would be the right choice. And yet now when you mention it, except for Rags the dog and the woman at the farm, there are no female voices in, at least I don't think there's Mary. So
yeah,
but there aren't a lot of female voices. So
no, there's not. But I understand your rationale behind choosing a female to narrate the book, because if it was originally intended for a kid, most of the time you're having your mom read you the story and it's soothing, and you know what I mean? So it makes sense.
Well, plus it made sense to me that for the points where it was a little intense, that the female voice would soften that intensity. Does that make sense too? Anyway, you did a great job, but I didn't realize how cruel we were being.
No, not at all. Like I said, again, it stretched me, so that was really welcome on my end.
Well, you were about to go on with how you settled on a couple of the voices.
I was. So I knew that Jacob was older, and I knew that he came across in the story, at least, as wiser, and he never seemed to be bothered by all the hustle and bustle of life. So for him, I made his voice slower and more methodical, with a breathiness and a soft tone.
I will give him to no one for now. Holding a hand up, Jacob signaled that the conversation was over. I am the master of this caravan, and I will say what we will do with this donkey and when.
Very rarely did I have Jacob raise his voice because he didn't usually allow himself to get bothered, like I said before. And people looked to him for wisdom. So I felt like his voice was very fitting, with a breathier tone and just more relaxed and drawn out, as if he were thinking about every word that was coming out of his mouth. And then on the other extreme was Hegbar. He was one of the three bandits, and I knew you described him as plump and shrimpy, so he's a large, small man. That makes sense. Right. With a personality that just makes you want to cringe. At least every time I read his lines, I was like, so I knew that he constantly was seeking to stir up conflict, and he was always under somebody's skin. Yep. So therefore, I found it fitting that his voice made the listener cringe as well.
Good. Now let's see if we can finagle another meal from some kind soul on this caravan,
Hegbar said, rubbing his prominent stomach.
So I made him whiny and squeaky. And to distinguish him further from the other bandits, at least, because Hegbar and Duran have the same pitch of their voice almost. It's very close. But you asked specifically that Hegbar have a lisp, so I added that in there, and I think it worked just right.
Yeah, I think it did too. And I was extremely happy with Zedar, because he had a darkness too. I mean, he was in a similar tone, but he kind of had, his speech had an evilness to it, and a manipulative element to it the whole time. To me, Duran was kind of the empty head in the group, kind of. Yeah. So he could have a somewhat sinister voice, but it was less dark and intense. And I think you did a great job on all three of the thieves. So, and was there any character that you struggled with more than another?
I would say, at first I struggled a little bit with Yellum, simply because I knew who he was supposed to be, but I didn't actually know how to capture that in his voice as much. So I came to the point with him where I realized he really is an ordinary donkey, but he just has a very extraordinary story.
You can't trick me into doing something I don't want to do, my little friend, Yellum said, shaking his head. I want no part of this.
Then come up with a better idea, Rags challenged him.
Give me some time. I'll think of something.
So I don't think the actual pitch of his voice or anything about his voice, other than, he sounds a little bit brash when he speaks at times. Other than that, his voice shouldn't sound out of the ordinary. So I just played a lot with his brashness and how it kind of got a little bit softer towards the end, because he was changed by his friends and by the whole story. And so I think out of everybody, the voice that should have been the easiest was kind of the hardest.
Well, it started out with him being a newborn, and you did a really good job of having a higher pitch and a little bit more childlike delivery. And then in the middle, then the part where he's angry and all of that, you got that edge and brashness and sharpness. And then in the end, he does have that softer. So I mean, may have been hard, but I was very satisfied with
Wonderful.
how he made it all the way from the beginning to end in that transition, which was what I had envisioned when I was writing it.
Good.
Did you enjoy any of the characters more than another?
I think I really enjoyed voicing Sam, actually,
Yeah.
because when I first was thinking of a voice for him, I knew that he was doppy. I knew that he wasn't really confident in himself. And I know that early on in my life, I kind of felt like that. And so I kind of made him sound a little bit more nasally, kind of like the underdog in school with the
Yeah.
glasses. And we all know is a little bit nerdier early in life. And then all of a sudden, one day they grow up and they protect everybody. And
Right.
that's how I envisioned him to be. And so I worked with him in that way. And I found that I really liked his personality and his character and how he really drew the group together a
Oh,
lot,
yeah.
especially in the last scene when they're above all the action of Jesus being born. He's really the one kind of holding them together, which
Yeah.
is big. So
Do you, I'm terribly at focusing. I mean, literally, I told Robin this morning, last night, I was writing in the novel I was writing on while my wife was watching a movie. And because of her issues going on, she was constantly asking me questions about what was going on in the movie. And I'm writing my book because when I was in college, if I was in a quiet room trying to read a book, I'd fall asleep because I had nothing to compete against it. There was nothing to force me to be in my head. So literally, especially when I edit, I'm listening. Maybe I may be listening to an audiobook in my ears while I'm editing my book. That probably showed
oh
up in the
wow.
book. But I'm wondering, and a reason I rattled on was you're reading a book as a narrator, but you're also reading a story for the first time. Do you ever get sucked away from the narration and into the story, or is that just something you lock out from the moment you walk into your palatial recording studio?
For me personally, that those two things tied together. When I start to get invested in the story that I'm reading, I feel like my narration oftentimes gets better. So it plays into each other and it actually starts to flow even better. Usually when a story is disjunct, it's a little harder to narrate and I have to go back and I have to figure out what's happening in the story and then I have to, kind of rework it and knowingly put pauses here and that kind of stuff. But I didn't have to do that with this story because it drew me in and it focused me in right away and it just flowed from there.
A check will be arriving shortly for you saying that. Well, that's nice to hear. And I would never be able to be a narrator for a variety of reasons, but most of which I would just lose all the voices while I was getting into the story. Were there any parts of the story that you struggled with, or things that you had to go? I assume you had to go back once in a while because you did a very good job. If you did, I didn't hear much of it, except for those last edits that we did, which were more difficult to work in. But is there any part of the book that was more difficult?
When I'm thinking back about it, there was never a spot where I had to go back and rework it because it was an issue with the story itself. Usually, if I went back and I reworked something, it was either because I had way too much extraneous noise that I had to edit out, or I was partially sick and all of my nasal consonants ended up sounding like this the whole time. Or
Oh, that's right. You had a whole besides moving, besides 2 kids, you all you were sick during much of this.
My
Um,
children got me sick for the whole month of October. So
which,
that was
which,
fun.
which was, I often say, life is what happens when you're planning for it. It happens on its own. Yeah, that I'd forgotten about that. My books, all my books, even my murder mystery, is intended to be written in a way that's not going to be off-putting and mainly uplifting. That was my goal for Yellum. That's the goal for Fresh Snow. That's the goal for the books I'm writing about my mother's life, to be inspiring. Do you feel Yellum accomplished that?
I look at the story of Yellum, and what inspired me was the fact that even though it's a fun, loving story about the donkey that carried Mary to Bethlehem, I think the beauty in it for me is that you still shed the light on our Savior Jesus Christ. And I think that's very important, because since it is a book that might appeal to a vast array of ages, it can get any age of a person questioning, well, who is this person that he's speaking of? And then they start to ask questions and dig a little deeper. So I think that in particular was inspiring to me, as well as um, as you know, I moved away from home recently because my husband got a job up here in New York. And so one of the big things that I enjoyed about this story is the interweaving lives of the characters. Uh, so I suppose a caravan does not allow people or animals to stay away from each other for long. And when you spend a lifetime making different memories together and sharing memories about adventures with each other, it changes your life overall. And so I guess it taught me that no matter how far apart we seem, we are always closer than we think. And the distance never, ever comes between good friends. And so moving 5 hours away from my family has brought this message to the forefront of my mind, that it doesn't matter how far apart we are. We are a phone call away. It's not the same, but no matter what, when we get back together, we share all those stories. We still love each other the same. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about this story, is just how the lives of the characters are just always interweaving, and they always love each other no matter where they are, or they hate each other like Chi, but that's okay. That's a story for another
Well,
day.
you have to have an antagonist in there, or two in
Absolutely.
there. Well, that was beautiful. I feel the same way. I lived in California for many years away from my family. But like, your family's in your head, and every time you're with them, some of that's in your head gets revitalized, comes back to the surface, and then when you're not with them, it helps keep you going, and it is displayed every day in how you are, because you carry that into how you live your life.
Mhm.
That you did a great job, and it was very Herculean, because it was a timeline and all of that stuff, and you met everything. How did that impact your opinion about doing this more in the future?
It is definitely something that I would love to pick back up and pursue in the future. But at this point, I'm gonna I'm putting a hard halt, simply because I don't feel like I have the ability to provide the time and energy that's needed to do my best work. And that wouldn't be fair to me as an artist, but it's definitely not fair to the author of the book, because I want to make the best quality product that makes your story come to life. And if I can't do that, then I'm not doing my job. So with almost 3 kids and me staying at home and having to raise them all, I think it's important for me to distinguish that this is a time when I need to make sure that I'm focusing on that and then pick that back up later. But it hasn't deterred me too much from thinking about doing some shorter voiceover work. That's something I've always been interested in. You mentioned Pixar earlier. Before I even knew I was going to be a wife or a mother, I always dreamed of working for Pixar, but that's beside the point. I've always been interested in doing commercial work or video voiceover work for shorter things that won't be as time consuming. But the whole process and everything, I love it. But I definitely want to do it in the future for sure.
Well, you certainly, both in what you've shared today, educated me and make me even more impressed by who you are and what you bring to this, and how committed you are to the work that you do, especially when the content is something that touches your heart so deeply. And I really appreciate that. And so I'm going to hold on to my mother's books till you're ready. Okay.
Okay.
And there are a lot of women's voices in that.
Oh, nice. That'll be great.
Anyway, it's been a joy. Thank you for taking the time to share with us, and let's talk again soon. We'll be in touch, because we want to know how the new baby thing goes, and how the rest of your efforts are going.
It's been a pleasure working with you, Gary.
Yeah.
You've made this whole process very easy, so thank you.
Well, you're welcome. And this is Katherine E.D. Swift, who narrated my book Yellum and did a terrific job. I hope you all go out and get it and listen to it, because it is inspirational in all ways. Thanks, Katie.
My
Talk to you
pleasure.
again. Bye-bye.
Bye.